So, we are going to, very obviously, we're going to dedicate the learning this evening in the memories and the merit of the people who were the victims of this horrific massacre in Israel. So, both in the memories of those who were murdered and in the merit of those who are in need of whatever brachas they need, hostages and people who are injured and so forth. We're in the middle of chapter 9, which puts us, if you want to look inside the book, on page 38. In the middle of page 38. I'm going to put it on the screen in just a second, but I just want to do a little bit of catch-up as to what we're talking about. And I was a little disappointed because I was hoping that we were closer to the end of this chapter, only because the last line of this chapter is particularly relevant to what we're dealing with in the world right now. So I thought it might be, a nice opportunity. But anyhow, everything happens in the way that it should. So we're on page 38, and if you have a look, just to give context, it's about, I'm guessing it's about 10 lines from the bottom of the page. The first word on the line is me'umka in the English. It would be in the second, about halfway down the second column of the English. I'm going to stick it on the screen. So just for context, what are we talking about? This is one of the most important sections of Tanya, because what it does over here is he started off by introducing us to the idea that we have two souls, that we have a godly soul and that we have an animal soul. And this chapter tells us about the conflict between those two souls. So the godly soul obviously has one particular agenda, and the animal soul has a different agenda. Now, when we started to study this chapter, which was just before Yom Tov, we studied that the Alter Rebbe uses the imagery of two kings who are fighting for control of a city. That's how he illustrates the idea of this internal conflict. Subsequently, since we last studied together, the whole concept of two forces battling for a piece of territory has suddenly leapt out at us and become much, much more of an issue, a burning issue at the moment. So I think it's valuable for us to recognize that the way the Torah looks at life is that life happens in two realities at the same time. So life happens on a personal level, and life happens on a global level. So for example, the Gemara says that a person is an olam katan. A human is a microcosm, a miniature version of the world. And just to give the flip side, the Gemara also says that the world is an Adam Gadol, that the whole globe is like one oversized human being. That's a fascinating principle. Because firstly, what that means is that the behavior and the actions of individuals has an impact on everything, on the entire globe, on the entire universe actually. And the other side of it is that we need to appreciate that the kind of things that happen in the world at large, including the great conflicts in the world, are a reflection of the internal conflicts that we have. That's a really interesting principle. And both sides of that principle are very important, because very often you see something happening on the global scale and you think, well, what difference could I make? These are massive things that are outside of my control. This is the purvey of big governments and presidents of countries and so on and so forth. I'm just an ordinary citizen, what am I going to do? How am I going to make a difference? How am I going to have an impact? So to understand this principle that the world is that the human is an olam katan, that a human being is a microcosm of the world, is effectively to understand that inside of us is a network that is tapped into the network of the whole of existence. So the things that we do and the behavior that we follow and the choices that we make do have an impact on global issues. And that's a foundational principle of Judaism. That's why we don't believe that the only way to solve problems is through diplomacy or through the military or whatever the case is. We actually believe that a key way that we have an influence on what goes on in the world is through our behavior as an individual. So for example, now with this whole tefillin campaign, this massive tefillin campaign for Israel. So what you're seeing is, individuals on a consistent basis who understand and appreciate the fact that if they do an action in their private capacity, in their own space, that it will have an impact, a positive impact on what's going on in Israel. It's a phenomenal thought. And we truly believe this. And we truly believe that we are shifting the balance of power, that we're influencing the outcome by individual choices that we make. And that's why this chapter is so interesting, because the principles that we're going to see, which are the principles of the conflict between our own neshama and our nefesh habahamis, our animal soul, are very similar to the principles of conflict on the global scale between forces of positive and forces of negative, between good and evil. It's very, very similar. And in the same way as the two souls are vying for control of the human being, so you've got these two mega perspectives or ideologies that are vying for control of the world. And that's exactly what's happening now. Is that, perhaps once upon a time we could have thought that the world was a little bit more multinational, but we've reached a point in the last few days where it's literally two sides. Either you're with this side or you're with that side. There's nobody who's kind of sitting on the fence at the moment. All the people who were on the fence have now kind of picked a side. So it's this conflict on a grand scale that reflects the internal conflict that each one of us has. Which, by the way, also means that how our personal spiritual conflict pans out also has an influence on how the broader international conflict pans out, which is also a fascinating principle. So it's not only about I'm going to do a mitzvah and it's going to empower the forces of good and it's going to empower the Jewish nation, but actually when I work with myself to overcome my own distractions and temptations, that in itself empowers the forces of positive to be able to overcome the forces of negative. So it's a very profound concept. Now, where we are in this conversation is we started talking about what is the goal and objective of the divine soul, of the nefesh elikis, because that's the first thing we want to address, obviously, because the nefesh elikis, the godly soul, is the most important part of who we are. So the first thing that we want to discuss is, so the nefesh elikis, what does it want? Or to put it into different words, what does our neshama want? And so far what we've learned is that the nefesh elikis wants control. It wants a person's mind to think in a way that is aligned with how Hashem thinks. So in other words, to think positive thoughts and to think holy thoughts and to think how we can do more of what Hashem wants. And the Nefesh Elikis wants our mouth to speak in a way that is aligned with what Hashem wants. So our Nefesh Elikis wants us to speak in a refined manner, in an honest way, to say words of prayer, to say words of Torah learning. That's what it wants. And the Nefesh Elikis wants the limbs of the body, the human being, the actual physical anatomy of the human being, to be on call to do the things that the Torah expects of us. So the Nefesh Elikis sees an arm as a vehicle to either give tzedakah or put on tefillin, or that kind of thing. The Nefesh Elikis sees the human heart as a vehicle to be able to feel sensitivity to another person, to be able to feel a passion towards Hashem, and so on. So that's what it wants. That's what the Nefesh Elikis wants, and that's as far as we've got so far in the chapter, is to understand that our own neshama would love to be in control of all of our functions, so that our functions would be aligned with what Hashem wants for the world. But what we're going to learn tonight is that the Nefesh Elikis is not satisfied with only gaining control. Now, again, the parallels between what we're learning now and what's going on in the world are incredibly, incredibly interesting. Because let's just step out of the Tanya for one moment and just look from a purely political, military perspective. What is a Jewish military victory? What does it look like for the Jewish people to have success militarily? What does it look like from a Jewish value standpoint to have won the war against our enemies? What does it look like? I don't know. Any thoughts? Any suggestions? What do you think it looks like?
No casualties.
Okay, so the first thing, obviously, that is really close to our hearts is that our forces should come back unscathed, because we prioritize life. It's a very important part of being Jewish, is that you preserve life and that you celebrate life. And so the thought of sending our people into war is fundamentally an objectionable position. We don't want to do it. Unfortunately, we sometimes have to do it. But it's not something that we glorify, and it's not something that we celebrate. And we certainly see no value in a person coming back as a war veteran, right? We don't see any value in that. We see the value in a person coming back whole. So yes, that is definitely part of what we would consider victory, is that our people come back unscathed. What else? What else would constitute Jewish victory? Now you're going to see in a moment that what constitutes the things we think are Jewish victory are not necessarily what constitutes Jewish victory. So what else? I think if you had to ask anybody who's got...
How about unity, Rabbi?
Unity. So do we have to have a conflict? Do we have to have a conflict in order to have unity?
It seems like it.
I would put a very big unfortunately in that sentence. Because if we're going to say that we require conflict in order to have unity, in other words, external conflict in order to have internal unity, then that is a big unfortunately, right? And if the success of our military is that we bring unity, yes, I think that would definitely be considered success, but it doesn't describe what success or victory looks like in the context of the enemy. That describes what victory looks like in the context of ourselves. So what does victory look like for the Jewish people in the context of our enemies? It's a really interesting, very interesting thought. So if you had to speak to any military person, I'm pretty certain that all of them would concur that victory looks like you've reached a point where you've completely destroyed your enemy. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you've killed every last person, but it means that you've destroyed the enemy to the extent that they no longer have the capacity to be an enemy. I'm pretty certain that that's what any military personality would consider to be victory. And if you want to look in the Torah, you could say, well, we have the instruction to do exactly that with the nation of Amalek. That what the Torah requires of us is that we timche esecher Amalek. We completely eradicate not only Amalek themselves, but any vestige of the fact that there ever was an Amalek. So that might be what people would consider the benchmark of what victory, military victory, looks like in Judaism. So let's now translate that into the language of the Nefesh Elokis. So again, there's two forces internally within ourselves that are fighting. We have the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, and we have the Nefesh Abahamis, the animal soul, and they're fighting with each other. So if we had to go with a view that victory is you completely annihilate the enemy, then the implication is that victory for the Nefesh Elokis, for the divine soul, would be to completely rid us of the Nefesh Abahamis, of the animal soul. Okay, now the question we have to ask is, would that be accurate? Is that the goal and objective of the Nefesh Elokis? It's an interesting concept, interesting thought. Somebody sent a private message over here to say that the what would be considered success in Jewish terms would be to reveal Hashem in the world. Now that's obviously looking now from a more spiritual perspective, and I don't disagree with it, that obviously that would be considered a Jewish victory, is if there's awareness of Hashem in the world where previously there wasn't. And of course there's the implication that the reason there's conflict in the world is because Hashem is not revealed, right? In exactly the same way as siblings might fight when the parents are not around. But when the parent walks into the room, suddenly they behave. So in a similar kind of way, you could say, well, when Hashem is revealed in the world, then there's going to be less conflict in the world. And so, sure enough, a victory would include this manifestation of godliness in the world. But here's an interesting thing. As far as Judaism is concerned, you learn this from King David. King David writes this in the 55th chapter of Tehillim, where he describes that King David unfortunately had many conflicts in his life. He had conflicts that involved other nations, and he had conflicts that involved members of his own family. So when he talks about the conflict that he had with members of his own family, towards the end of the 55th chapter of Tehillim, he says, Pada b'shalom nafshi mikrovli. What did Hashem do for me? He redeemed me peacefully from those who wished to have war with me. So effectively what he's saying is, they were warmongering, and then it didn't come to that. It came to a peaceful conclusion. Now, the problem with the word peace for most people is that most people want a feel-good peace, which basically means that the two sides put aside their differences and they live side by side and everybody lives happily ever after, and it has a Disney ending, and then that's it. That's what everybody considers to be peace. Now, if you have an inkling of an understanding of what a true conflict is about, it's really difficult to expect that both sides are just going to pretend there's no conflict, and they're going to go ahead, living side by side in peace. That's not exactly what peace means. In fact, we have a precedent of what peace means, and that is, as I'm sure you're familiar with the pasuk, because we say it, the verse, we say it every day when we daven. We say it 3 times a day when we daven. If a person is unfortunately saying Kaddish, they'll say it more than 3 times. We say, Oise Shalom Bimroimav. He who makes peace in the higher realms, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael, he should give us and all of Israel peace. So the Gemara asks, what does it mean when it says that Hashem makes peace in the higher realms? I don't know about you, but I didn't ever think that there was conflict in the heavens. Who's fighting? Who's fighting in the heavens? And so the Gemara says that there are 2 archangels that represent totally opposite energies. You have the archangel Michael, who represents the energy of Chesed and is represented by the element of water. And you have the archangel Gabriel that represents strictness and judgment and is represented by the element of fire. And the 2 can't coexist. Obviously, water and fire cannot coexist. The only way that water and fire can coexist is there has to be a barrier in between them. So if you put water into a pot and then you put it on a fire, then you can have a viable result. But if you try and put the fire and the water together, one of them has to die. So they can't coexist. What does Hashem do? Hashem brings them into coexistence, because obviously Hashem is not only greater than the 2 of them, but also greater than the things that separate and divide them, and therefore Hashem could bring them all together. So that's how it is in the highest realms. That's where you can speak about peace, is that everybody coexists. But in our reality, and to understand what the purpose is of being a Jewish person, the ultimate state, the ultimate victory is not coexistence, nor is the ultimate victory annihilation of the enemy. The ultimate victory for a Jewish mind is to transform the antagonist into a protagonist. To transform the enemy to become not an individual who accepts us, but rather an individual who lives with our values. That is the ultimate victory. So just to use an illustration that's outside of the world of international conflicts, look at the prison system. So if, God forbid, a person has been a victim of crime, obviously the victim wants the criminal to be put away and have the maximum punitive measures. The statistics, though, show that if we take somebody who already is introduced into the world of criminality and we stick them in a prison, the chances are that they're going to eventually, when they come out after their sentence, be a worse criminal than they were when they went in, because all they've been exposed to in all of this time is criminals, and probably criminals who are harsher than they were, and you've got to toughen up, otherwise, all kinds of things can happen. Whereas, if there were a system, and certain prisons in certain parts of the world have this system, where you're looking instead to rehabilitate the criminal, that is success. If somebody comes out of the penitentiary system, and now they are healthy, and they have good values, and they have a good work ethic, and they take responsibility for their lives, that would be a success story. So that's what Jewish victory looks like. Jewish victory isn't that we smash them physically. Jewish victory is that we got them to the point that they share our values. That's considered the ultimate conquest. You get somebody else to appreciate the morality that we believe, to appreciate the high authority that we subscribe to understand that it is unacceptable to be in a state of conflict, so on and so forth. So now let's translate that into the Nefesh Elikis and the Nefesh Abahamis. The Nefesh Elikis, the godly soul, does not have any interest in eradicating the animal soul. It's not helpful. It's not aligned with the philosophy of the Torah. So that cannot be the approach. So what is the approach? What does the Nefesh Elikis want? So let's read inside, and then we'll just unpack it a little bit. So, like I said, it's on page 38. I don't know, it's approximately 10 lines or so from the bottom of the page. First word on the line is me'umka. If you're looking on the screen, it is 7 lines from the bottom of this page that's on the screen, and we're going to go from the 4th last word, which is the word she-yi-ye. So the first word on the line is me'umka, and we're going from the 4th last word, or basically the 5th word on the line, which is she-yi-ye. What is the intention of the Nefesh Elikis, of the godly soul? She-yi-ye, Yeah, this is exactly what we are. Basically, what the Nefesh Elokis wants is that the heart, particularly what we've called the right side of the heart, because allegorically we speak about the right side of the heart being the part that is associated with the godly soul, and the left side of the heart being the part that is associated with the animal soul. So the Nefesh Elokis wants the right side of the heart, that is the healthier part, or the more aspirational part, or the more altruistic part of the heart, to be toichoi rotzuf ahava, to be absolutely filled with a passionate love and enthusiasm for God, mole, to the point of being absolutely full of love. Vegodush, not only full, but overflowing. You know how we do Kiddush, or particularly Havdalah, where we overflow the cup? Because in Judaism, the ultimate expression of brocha is when there is so much brocha, you actually can't contain it. So the Nefesh Elokis wants the love and passion that we feel inside of ourselves towards Hashem to be so powerful and so intense that it overflows from its natural precinct. The natural place where love of Hashem should express itself is in the right side of the heart, which effectively means the emotional makeup of the neshama. That's where that love should be. But the Nefesh Elokis is not satisfied with that. Rather, it wants ad shetispashet gam lecholol asmoli. The Nefesh Elokis wants the love of Hashem to be so profound and so intense that it overflows into the neighboring chamber of the heart. In other words, it floods the Nefesh HaBahamis with love. And that would then cause that would then overwhelm and subdue the negativity. Yesod hamayim haroim sheba, which, referring back to what we said in chapter 1, is the element of unhealthy water, she'ataiva shemiklipas noiga, which is the desires that belong to klipa, and I'm going to talk in a second what we mean about klipa and klipas noiga. L'shanoiso ulahofcha mitai negei olam hazeh la'avas Hashem, to transform the passion that people have for things of this world into passion for Hashem. Okay, let's understand what's going on over here. The Gemara tells a fascinating story. The Gemara says, just picture the scene. The council of rabbis gets together. We're talking now hundreds of years ago. The councils of rabbis at a time where they were writing the Talmud, where they were very, very great sages. And they came to the conclusion that they had the wherewithal to be able to cancel the Yetzer Hara. They had enough power that they could completely rid humanity of the Yetzer Hara. Now, before we go any further, let's just define what we mean over here by Yetzer Hara. How do you translate Yetzer Hara? What's the evil inclination, right? That's usually how people translate it. The evil inclination, which is, I don't think it's a very useful term, because it's not like evil inclination sounds like the language we use in any other sphere of life except this one, right? Evil inclination. So let's change it a little bit. We'll say that the Yetzer Hara is perhaps a person's predisposition to unhealthy choices. That's what a Yetzer Hara is. It's a predisposition to unhealthy choices. Of course, we're talking over here about spiritual choices specifically. So it's because we have that predisposition. That's why we do things that we're not supposed to do. That's why we speak badly about other people. That's why we eat things we're not supposed to eat, do things we're not supposed to do, etc. Because of the Yetzer Hara. So the rabbis all get together and they came up with a plan that there's a way to annihilate the Yetzer Hara. Okay, so it's exactly what we were talking about, to totally destroy the enemy. That's what they came up with. Now, once you read this Gemara, because you're going to see in a minute what happened next, you're going to see that the specific area of the Yetzer Hara, in other words, they didn't necessarily propose that they were in a position to totally eradicate any inclination to do something inappropriate, but they did believe that they were going to be able to neutralize inappropriate sexual desire. That they felt that they could completely remove from humanity. So imagine, like all the rabbis are sitting around, they're going to take a vote. Should we do this or not? We found the formula, and we know how to kill promiscuity. So are we going to do it or not? And they start having this conversation, and the Gemara comes to the conclusion that they realized that you can't do it. Because if you kill desire, you kill humanity, quite practically. Because the drive, the drive that people have, the physical, temptation that people have is part and parcel of what is necessary to keep humans alive, to be able to perpetuate the species. There has to be some level of desire. So they recognize that if you completely eradicate the enemy, you actually come out with no value. Because if you completely eradicate the enemy, the result is you don't have healthy natural drives either. So the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, looks at the human being and says, I know what the problem is with this human being. The problem is that the human being has too much hedonistic desire. And if you think about it, I'm not saying that's the only problem that we have, but it is certainly a very big part of our spiritual malaise, right? Is hedonistic desire. Whatever those desires might be. So it could be that a person loves wealth. It could be that a person loves fame. It could be that a person simply loves themselves. But all of that fits under this umbrella of, if you don't want to call it hedonistic, you can call it self-indulgent desire. Because that is the most common, I suppose, human experience, is that we care about ourselves, and we care about ourselves to the extent that we will indulge ourselves. So the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, I suppose we could almost use the expression, if it was a knee-jerk reaction, would say, kill all self-indulgence. It's not appropriate. We should be focused on God. We should be focused on the greater good. We should be altruistic. Who do we think we are to start caring about, did I get what I wanted? I'll tell you an interesting story. When we were in yeshiva, I remember once the guys were talking at a Farbrengen about when you go to a wedding. Now, bear in mind that this is a wedding in Kfar Chabad in Israel, which is not necessarily the most luxurious and extravagant place that you're going to find on earth. So it's not like our weddings. So what was the conversation? The conversation was when the waiter comes around and asks you if you prefer the dark or the white of the chicken, you should say it doesn't make a difference. Because what kind of self-indulgence is that? Like, I have to know, whatever, you're giving me chicken, I should be grateful that I have chicken. Thank you very much. And that's it. Don't become so materialistic. Don't become so self-absorbed that I have to have the kind of chicken that I like. That was the talk at that particular time. And it's something, as you can see, that stuck with me many, many years later, because it's really quite an interesting insight. It's very different to how our world works. In our world, everybody believes that the things that they want, they deserve to have. And if they can't get them, that is actually a good enough reason for them to be depressed or to throw a tantrum or maybe even to loot a shop because I couldn't get what I want. Right? So the Nefesh Elokis looks at this and says, okay, we have two choices over here. The one choice, I want to control this human being. That's the objective of the godly soul, is to be totally in control of this human being so that the human being lives as Hashem wants them to live. So the Nefesh Elokis could say, okay, let's get rid of all desire. Let's break the natural settings of the human being. In other words, let's be some kind of authoritarian soul, which is basically going to say, right, this is not how things are going to be continuing, going forward, and I'm taking control now, and we're going to do things differently. So that's kind of like a possibility, right? That you might expect to happen. So comes along the Nefesh and the Nefesh Elokis, and the Nefesh Elokis says, wait, hang on one second. There's a teaching, actually, I'm going to use this teaching just to illustrate the point. There's a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov tells us that when you look in the Torah, there's a particular section where the Torah talks about what happens if you encounter somebody who you hate. That spawns another whole conversation. How is it possible that you should be allowed to hate anybody that the Torah actually considers the possibility that you're hating? Okay, that's another conversation. But it says, what happens if you see somebody who you really hate and their donkey is overloaded and it can't handle its load, so the donkey is in distress. So you might say, the Torah says, you might say, I'm not getting involved. I hate this guy. Why must I be the one to help his donkey? So the Torah says, Azov ta'azov imoy. No, actually, this is a time where you dafka have to help the guy. And some of the commentators say that it's a test of your value system, that you help somebody dafka because you don't want to help them. So the Baal Shem Tov says there's another layer, like everything else in the Torah, there's another layer to this particular story. The story is like this. The word for a donkey in Hebrew, how do you say donkey in Hebrew? Chamor. So you say donkey, right? So the word for a donkey in Hebrew is a chamor. The letters of that word chamor are also the letters that form the word chomer. Chomer is matter. So now we're going to read this verse, but from a perspective or through the lens of Jewish mysticism. Ki sir'eh chamor, when you look at the materialistic parts of your life, which is the human body, the animal soul, the various things that the human body engages with or indulges in, that the human body really wants to have, you will see soin acha. Now we're changing the word slightly. The conventional translation is a donkey of soin acha, the person you hate. Now we're going to look at it from the perspective, the donkey, the materialism of this world, soin acha, hates your spiritual progress, because if a person is indulgent and materialistic, the last thing they want is to become all religious and altruistic. Who needs it? I want to enjoy life, eat, drink, and be merry. So that part of ourselves, the materialistic part of ourselves, hates what we're trying to do in terms of our personal growth. And if you don't believe that that's true, try get up in the morning for the minyan. And then you'll know that your body hates spiritual growth. Right? So what do? So the Torah said you might think that you shouldn't help that animal that's struggling. In the same way, says the Baal Shem Tov, you might think that you shouldn't help your human side, your physical side, your animal soul, that's probably struggling to keep up with all the things that the Torah expects. It's not my neshama that's struggling. It's my human side that's struggling. That's the part of us that has a hard time keeping our mouth shut. That's the part of us that has a hard time learning Torah every single day, or getting up in time to be able to daven with a minyan, or whatever the case is. So you might think, break it. Ignore it. Say, listen here, you're self-indulgent, good for nothing. I'm not playing your game, and you need a bit of a kick in the pants. Annihilate the enemy. Says the Baal Shem Tov, the Torah says that's exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do. Azoiv ta'azoiv imoy. Now, the direct translation of that is, you should help with him. And the Gemara learns certain legal elements out of that. But the message over here is, you help with your donkey. In other words, the goal is to get the animal soul on board. The goal of conquest is not to eradicate the enemy. The goal of conquest is to get to a point where the enemy shares your values, and therefore is no longer your enemy and is now your ally, because they actually appreciate where you're coming from. So that's what he's saying over here. That the objective of the nefesh elikis, of the godly soul, is that there should be so much love gushing through the person's system that the animal soul can't even escape the love. And so the great excitement and energy that it had for material things just gets redirected. Now let's talk about that in very simple terms. What are we actually saying over here? So I once heard a story that there was an individual who was a rabbi of a very large community. He had a very busy schedule, and he had an opportunity to speak to the Rebbe privately. And in the conversation, one of the things that he said to the Rebbe, he complained about the fact that he's got such a busy schedule, he doesn't get to study Torah at a level that is suitable to what he's capable of. In plain English, that means he spent all his time preparing shiurim for everybody else, and he never challenged himself to learn at a level that was difficult and challenging for him. He said he just didn't have the time. So the Rebbe advised him that what he should do is that at the end of the day, after he had finished everything on his schedule, then he should sit down and start to learn. And then the Rebbe told him that initially you're going to find that very difficult, but over time it will become easier. So he comes out from having had this conversation with the Rebbe, and he bumps into the legendary Chassid Reb Mendel Futterfass, who I tend to talk about a lot because I was privileged to know him. So Reb Mendel Futterfass was this incredible human being who stood up to the Soviet Union, spent many years in Siberian prisons, and then he became, in his later life, he became like the spiritual mentor in the yeshiva system in Israel. So this man comes out of his interview, his conversation with the Rebbe, and Reb Mendel says to him, what did the Rebbe tell you? So the Rebbe tells him, he said, I should study at the end of the day. Initially it will be difficult, and then it will get easier. So Reb Mendel said to him, so how did you understand what the Rebbe was telling you? So he said, I understood it simply. initially, the first few days or weeks of this program, I'll find it very difficult, but slowly but surely it will become routine, and then I'll get used to it. So Reb Mendel said, I don't think you understood what the Rebbe was telling you. The Rebbe was telling you that each night, at the end of the day, when you feel completely exhausted, and you sit down to learn, every single night it's going to feel difficult. But then, over time, it will get easier. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean it'll get easier? So we all know this, that one of the most difficult things to do is to get started in anything in life. The Gemara even uses the expression, Kol hascholois kashois. The beginning of any process is a really difficult place to be. You know, even when you think about creating momentum physically, you know, it's to initiate the amount of force that you have to exert on something to initiate momentum is far greater than once you already have momentum. But when it comes to learning, and this is exactly what he was talking about, just talking specifically about learning, there's something else that happens. When a person is not in the mood of learning, it's really difficult, and then we'll procrastinate and we'll do a whole lot of other things and we'll circle around, you know, not to have to actually confront what we should be doing, which is to learn. When we actually sit down to learn and we push through that initial phase where it feels like a drag, or it feels that we're too tired or distracted or whatever, what happens is the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, who has been pushing back and trying to avoid the learning. Why? Because the animal soul is an indulgent being. So why do I have to learn if I could rather be just sitting and watching the rugby? Why would I have to learn if I could just be, doom scrolling through Instagram or something like that? Like, why do I need this? The nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, wants to do things that are pleasurable. And it always goes for the path of least resistance. But when you get over that hurdle and you actually start to learn, the nefesh habahamis is also an intellectual. So it actually starts to enjoy. This actually is enjoyable. This is actually nice. So that's what the godly soul wants. The godly soul wants there to be so much passion and so much excitement about God in the system that the nefesh habahamis gets excited as well. So you don't have to fight against something that is excited to do what you're doing. That's what he's talking about over here. And so, this is Kamosha Kosuv Bechol Levavcha B'Shnei Yitzrecha. This is what we say in the Shema. We say that we are supposed to love God Bechol Levavcha, with all your heart. The Gemara in Brochos immediately says, the way that you say your heart in Hebrew is you say Libecha. There's an extra letter in that word. There's an extra base in that word. Levavcha. So why is there the extra letter in the word? So Gemara says it's basically alluding to the fact that there are two sides to the love of God that is expected of us. Bechol levavcha means b'shnei yitzrecha. It's not good enough for us to just love Hashem with a part of us that is already predisposed to loving Hashem. What's the chap of that? If we have a part of ourselves that is hardwired to want to connect to Hashem, then we can't claim a success if that part of us wants to connect to Hashem. The goal is b'chol levavcha, to get the part of us that is not interested in connecting to Hashem, that doesn't want to have that passionate relationship. We get that part of ourselves on board. Now that's an achievement. V'hainu, that means sheyale v'yovei v'yagia l'madregas ahava rabba. So basically what that means is that the nefesh elokis, again, remember we're only talking over here about what the goal and the aspiration and the objective of the godly soul is. What does the godly soul want? That we should elevate ourselves. And we should elevate ourselves to the point that we reach what is called ahava rabba, this intense love of God. You'll see sometimes in the davening we talk about it, there's something called ahavas olam, which is actually quite a rational, kind of acceptable, natural love towards Hashem. But the nefesh elokis wants us to get to ahava rabba, which is an unbridled love of Hashem. It's a love of Hashem that is so powerful that you can't direct it, you can't contain it, you can't tell it it's not for the other guy, it's not for the nefesh habahamis. It just floods and swamps everything with so much love and passion towards Hashem. V'chiba yesera, and this incredible cherishing, so to speak, towards Hashem, which is Yesayim Madregas Ahava Aza Kirish Be'esh, which is it's getting a little bit technical at this point, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but it's basically to get even higher to the kind of love that is described as a fiery love. Vehi hanikres bakasuv ahava beta'anugim. Here's the point that really is relevant to us. This is something that is described on occasion in the Torah as love with pleasure. Okay, now what does that mean? Love with pleasure. It's like a really, really bizarre kind of an expression. Let's try to understand what it means. And by the way, it's tanugim in the plural. Okay, what does that mean? So it's like this. Why do parents love their children so deeply? Because I've got news for you. There are many times in the parenting journey where it doesn't seem to make sense to love one's kids so deeply. You know, often those times where it's difficult to love your kids so much are around bedtime for some strange reason. Then you just want to. So why do parents love their kids so deeply? Because you have the love, like for example, between two friends, where two friends can become really close and they can really love each other in a very deep and meaningful way. That would be because of something that they had each invested into the friendship. That's how friendships are built. You have to invest in them. They don't happen in a vacuum. You could have the love of lovers. And that is a love where basically there's something about that person that I see as so attractive and I see as so valuable and I see as something I cherish so much. So therefore, I have this incredible love for that person. The love for a child is because there's something really, really deep within ourselves that just makes us feel so good. We tend to call it nachas. And it's really difficult. Have you ever tried to translate nachas? For somebody who's never heard of the word? How do you translate nachas? So people often translate it as pleasure, joy. The truth of the matter, pride. But each one of those actually has its own adjective in the Torah, its own description in the Torah. Right? There's simcha. There's geus, pride. There is, there's pleasure. What is nachas? So nachas is impossible to describe, but you could say this. When you experience nachas, it's something you experience throughout the whole of you in a very profound way. So in other words, when a person eats a very tasty meal, they get pleasure, but you can't say that the pleasure affects the whole human and in a profound way. The pleasure affects the palate, the eating experience, the dining experience. When a person gets nachas from a child, the nachas from the child is something that affects them so deep. That's what we're calling ahava b'ta'anugim, where I love something in such a profound way that I'm not going to trade it for anything else that might appear to be pleasurable. So, for example, and by the way, Hilton will probably agree with this, if you want to know the one thing that possibly trumps the love of a parent to a child, might be the love of a grandparent to a grandchild. Because you have the love without the responsibility. So it's kind of it's got a certain added value to it, right? But the point is that when a person has that depth of love, if a person is having a really good experience with their child, they don't want to trade it for something else that's also pleasurable. I'm having so much profound pleasure here. What can you offer me? What are you going to tell me? I'm going to go to a restaurant, I'm going to go sit on the beach. But right now I'm having this amazing interaction with my child. So Ahava b'ta'anugim is the same kind of experience, but with regards to Hashem. That's where again, remember we're talking about what the neshama wants. The neshama would like us to have such a deep and profound love towards Hashem that it feels as if it fills every single part of us in the most profound way, and therefore nothing else that's out there can compete. And the Nefesh Elokis wants this to be felt by the animal soul as well. That's its goal. Again, the Nefesh Elokis does not want to kick the Nefesh Bahamis out of the system. It wants it to feel and experience what it can get in the system. That's its goal. And so just to finish off the sentence, the Nefesh Elokis, the godly soul, wants the Nefesh Bahamis to share this immense pleasure related to having a relationship with Hashem, which actually should only be reserved for the world to come. And the Nefesh Elokis wants the Nefesh Bahamis to experience it in the now. So, to summarize, the new layer that we have learned about what the neshama wants from us is not just that the neshama wants the whole system to conform to what Hashem wants, but actually the neshama wants even the parts of us that are designed not to do what Hashem wants should get on board and should appreciate what Hashem wants and should feel the value and should feel the love. That's the goal of the Nefesh Elikis. And then we have the next section will basically unpack that in greater detail, and then the last part of the chapter will tell us, so what does the animal soul want? And that's basically how we'll see the contrast that explains our ongoing internal conflict.